Welcome to the podcast on completing the square. We will be demonstrating this by doing the example problem at the top. Solve x squared minus 5x minus 11 equals -3 by completing the square. Be careful on tests to make sure you do exactly what the question says, and if it says by completing the square, don't use the quadratic formula or some other method. Now, the strategy for completing the square is as follows. When you complete the square, what you're trying to do is use the square root property. So we want to take that original equation and we want to change the form to where we have x minus a or x plus a squared on one side. Now we call that a perfect square. When you have an expression that's squared like that, it's called a perfect square. And just another number on the other side. And then once we get that, we can use the square root property, which in this case would say x minus a is plus or minus the square root of b, so x is a plus or minus the square root of b. And then if we had it simplified, we'd be finished with the problem. So that's where we're going. We've got to try to create on the left side this perfect square. So let's get started. Okay, here's how we solve it. Now the first step 1, is to move the 11 to the right side. So up here I'm adding 11 to both sides, and I get x squared minus 5x equals 8. And step 2 says find the perfect square that starts off x squared minus 5x. We've already got those terms in here, x squared minus 5x. All we want to do is add a third term so that this becomes a perfect square. Well, it turns out that that's easy to do. To find the perfect square that starts off x squared minus 5x, just look at this number here that's multiplying x and divide it by 2. If you take half of the 5, you get 5 halves, so your perfect square is going to be x minus 5 halves squared. Now when you actually square x minus 5 halves, and you could do a little FOIL on your own paper there to see that this is true. When you square x minus 5 halves, you start off x squared minus 5x, which is just what we have in our problem. But then there's another term. There's a plus 25/4 that we don't have in our problem. So to do that, what we want to do is add the 25/4 on both sides. So we'll get x squared minus 5x plus 25/4. And now we can't just say that that's equal to 8 because the expression above, x squared minus 5x, was what was equal to 8. So if we now have x squared minus 5x plus 25/4, that has to equal to 8 plus 25/4. Now we're going to rewrite this left side in its perfect square form. The way we got that was by squaring x squared minus 5 halves. So we're going to write this, or x minus 5 halves. So we're going to write this as x minus 5 halves squared is equal to, and now in order to be able to combine those terms on the right, we have to have a common denominator. So instead of calling it 8, I'm going to call it 32/4 plus 25/4, and that will give us 57/4. So now we have the problem x minus 5 halves squared is equal to 57/4, and let's go back up top where we had a strategy. We wanted to make it x minus something squared equals something. That's what we've got. X minus 5 halves squared equals 57/4. So now we're ready to use the square root property. And the square root property says if m squared is equal to k, then m is positive or negative the square root of k. So here's our m, the x minus 5 halves. And we've got m squared equals k, so we write m, x minus 5 halves, is equal to positive or negative the square root of k, which is 57/4. But of course that 4 is a perfect square, so we just rewrite this as plus or minus the square root of 57, and then on the bottom we take the square root of 4, which is 2. Well, let's move the 5 halves to the other side, so we get x equals 5 halves plus or minus the square root of 57 over 2, and you could just leave it like that, or you could put them over a common denominator and call that 5 plus or minus the square root of 57 over 2. Now recall that that answer is simply a shorthand for two answers. In other words, one answer is x equals 5 plus the square root of 57 over 2. And if you decide to make a decimal answer out of that, make sure that before you go into your calculator you remember that there's a parentheses around that top. If you don't put a parentheses there, you'll get the wrong answer. And the second equation would be x equals 5 minus the square root of 57 over 2. And that is how you complete the square.